The living path had existed since before the first stars learned to burn. It stretched across the black emptiness of space like a river made of light, twisting and turning through dimensions that no species fully understood. Every civilization that reached the stars eventually found it. The Veloxi discovered it 12,000 years ago. The Cathari found it even earlier. The ancient silicate mines had mapped its currents when humans were still learning to use fire. For all these species, the path was a gift. It bent itself to accommodate their ships. It softened its energy storms when their vessels passed through. It whispered directions into the minds of their pilots, guiding them safely to distant worlds. The galactic civilizations built their empires on this miracle. They created trade routes and military highways. They connected colonies across thousands of light years. And not once did any of them stop to ask a simple question. What was the living path, really? Commander Jake Holloway stood at the observation window of the research vessel Meridian, watching the phenomenon pulse with colors that had no names in any human language. He was 43 years old, born in Ohio, and had spent 20 years in deep space. He had seen nebulae and black holes and the ruins of dead civilizations. But nothing had prepared him for this. The path was beautiful. It moved like a living thing, curving and flowing through the void with a grace that seemed almost intentional. The Galactic Concord had given humanity permission to observe it from a safe distance. They were new to the stars, these humans. They had only discovered faster-than-light travel 60 years ago. The older species tolerated them the way adults tolerate curious children. Lisa Tran, the ship's science officer, approached Jake with a tablet in her hands. She was young, barely 30, with sharp eyes and a mind that never stopped working. She had grown up in San Francisco, dreaming of stars she could not yet reach. Now she reached them daily, and still she wanted more. "Commander," she said, "I'm getting readings that don't match anything in the Concord's database." Jake turned from the window. "What kind of readings?" Lisa hesitated. This was the part she could not explain. "The path is responding to us. Every time one of our crew looks at it, there's a spike in its energy output. It's small, barely noticeable, but it's consistent." Jake frowned. "The Concord says the path is passive. It just exists. It doesn't react to anything." "I know what the Concord says," Lisa replied. "But the data doesn't lie. The path is watching us back." The idea seemed impossible. For thousands of years, countless species had used the living path without any hint that it possessed awareness. It was a tool, a convenience, a cosmic highway built by some long-vanished civilization or formed by natural forces no one understood. The thought that it might be alive, truly alive, was terrifying. Jake made a decision that would change the course of human history. He ordered the Meridian to stop. Not to approach the path, not to attempt contact, just to stop and observe. He wanted to see what the path would do when someone paid attention without asking for anything in return. For 3 days, nothing happened. The crew grew restless. The Galactic Concord sent messages asking why the Meridian had halted its survey. Jake ignored them. He sat by the observation window for hours, watching the path flow through the darkness, and he waited on the 4th day. The path stopped moving. Lisa's instruments went wild. Across the galaxy, ships that were traveling through the path suddenly found themselves frozen in mid-transit. The Veloxi Trade Senate declared a state of emergency. The Cathari war priests called for holy gatherings. The mournful ones, a species that communicated only through sorrow, began weeping in frequencies that could be heard across entire star systems. And through it all, the living path simply waited. It hung motionless in the void, its light pulsing slowly, as if it were breathing, as if it were thinking. "It's looking at us," Lisa whispered. She stood beside Jake at the window, her face pale with wonder and fear. It's actually looking at us. Jake nodded. He could feel it too, a presence pressing against his mind like a gentle hand. The path was aware of them. It had always been aware, waiting through billions of years for someone to notice. The Galactic Concord demanded answers. Ambassador Derek Cole, humanity's representative to the alien coalition, found himself facing a wall of accusations. The Veluxi claimed humans had sabotaged the path. The Cathari suggested it was an act of war. Even the neutral species, those who had remained peaceful for millennia, looked at humanity with suspicion. Derek was a patient man. He had spent 30 years learning to navigate alien politics, to smile when he wanted to shout, to find common ground where none seemed to exist. But even he struggled to explain what was happening. How could he tell these ancient civilizations that the thing they had taken for granted for so long had simply been waiting for someone to care? On the Meridian, Jake called a meeting of his senior staff. There were 12 of them gathered in the small conference room, their faces lit by the soft glow of the path through the windows. "We have a choice," Jake said. "We can back away, apologize to the Concord, and pretend this never happened. Or we can try to communicate." The room fell silent. Everyone understood the risk. If they approached the path wrong, they might anger it. If they angered it, they might doom not just themselves but their entire species. Lisa spoke first. "It's been waiting for billions of years. Every species that found it just used it and moved on. Not one of them ever said hello, because they didn't know it was alive," said Ben Carter, the ship's engineer. "Maybe they didn't want to know," Lisa replied. "Maybe it's easier to use something if you don't think about whether it has feelings." Jake looked out the window at the path. It was still motionless, still waiting. He thought about all the highways humans had built on Earth, cutting through forests and mountains without asking permission. He thought about all the rivers they had dammed, all the animals they had driven to extinction. And he thought about how, eventually, humanity had learned to do better. "We're going to say hello," Jake decided. "Whatever happens next, we're going to treat this thing like what it is. Someone, not something." Lisa began preparing a message. It would be simple, transmitted on every frequency they could generate. It would not ask for anything. It would not demand anything. It would simply say, "We see you and we want to understand." When the message was sent, the path shuddered. Its light rippled like water struck by a stone. And then, slowly and impossibly, it turned toward the meridian dot it had heard them. After billions of years of silence, it had finally heard someone speak. The galaxy had never known true silence until the living path stopped moving. Ships hung frozen in the space between stars. Trade routes that had operated for thousands of years went dark. The Veluxi, whose entire economy depended on fast transport, watched their markets collapse in a matter of days. The Cathari, warriors who had spread across 100 worlds, found their fleets scattered and stranded, and everyone blamed humanity. Ambassador Derek Cole stood before the Galactic Concord, surrounded by representatives of species that had walked among the stars when Earth was still a ball of molten rock. The chamber was vast, filled with beings of every shape and size. Some floated in tanks of liquid. Others existed as patterns of light. The mournful ones wept in the corner, their grief echoing through the room like distant thunder. "The humans have broken the path," declared High Trader Vex of the Veluxi. His body was covered in golden scales, and his 4 eyes burned with anger. "They must be punished." "We did not break anything," Derek replied, keeping his voice calm. "We simply observed it. We sent a greeting. That is all." "That's all. And now it refuses to move," Vex snapped. "Billions of credits lost. Colonies cut off from supplies. This is your fault." Derek wanted to argue, but he knew it would do no good. The Concorde had already made up its mind. Humanity was young and weak and convenient to blame. It did not matter that they had done nothing wrong. Back on the Meridian, Lisa Tran had not slept in 3 days. She sat in her laboratory, surrounded by screens filled with data, trying to understand what the path was telling them. Because it was telling them something. The energy patterns it emitted were not random. They were structured, organized, like a language written in light. "These are questions," she told Jake, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Look at the patterns. They repeat, but with variations. It's asking us things." Jake leaned over her shoulder, staring at the data. He could not read it the way she could, but he trusted her. "What kind of questions?" Lisa shook her head. "I don't know yet. But I think it's been asking them for a very long time. Billions of years, maybe. And no one ever answered." The thought was heartbreaking. A being of immense power and ancient age, reaching out across the cosmos, begging for a connection and finding only species that treated it like a road to be traveled. Jake thought about how lonely that must have been. He thought about how desperate. On Earth, the Global Space Authority convened an emergency session. Leaders from every nation gathered to discuss the crisis. Some wanted to apologize to the Concorde and abandon all contact with the path. Others saw an opportunity, a chance to gain knowledge and power that could lift humanity above its rivals. Dr. Ben Archer stood before the assembly and offered a different perspective. He was 52 years old, a theoretical physicist who had spent his career studying phenomena that defied explanation. He had wild gray hair and kind eyes, and he spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen wonders. "The path is not a tool," he said. "It never was. Every species that found it assumed it existed to serve them. They used it without question, without curiosity, without gratitude. And the path let them because it was desperate for any contact at all." "What are you suggesting?" asked the chairman. "I'm suggesting that the path has been waiting for someone to treat it like a person instead of a thing. And humanity is the first species in billions of years to do that." The assembly murmured. Some looked skeptical. Others looked afraid. But a few, just a few, looked hopeful. Lisa's breakthrough came on the 5th day. She had been running the path signals through every translation algorithm she could find, comparing them to known languages, looking for patterns. And finally, she found them. The questions were simple. "Who are you? Why are you here? Do you see me?" She wept when she decoded them. Not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of what she had discovered. A being older than most stars, asking the universe if anyone could see it, asking for billions of years. And hearing nothing but silence, she brought her findings to Jake, who read them with a heavy heart. "It just wanted someone to notice," he said quietly. "All this time, all this power, and all it wanted was to be seen." "We need to answer," Lisa said. "Really answer. Not just a greeting, but a conversation. We need to ask it questions, too." Jake nodded. He understood the risk. The Concorde had already threatened humanity with sanctions. The Cathari were talking about military action. If they pushed further, they might start a war. But if they stopped now, they would be just like all the other species. They would use the path and move on, never knowing what they had abandoned. "Prepare a transmission," Jake ordered. "Ask it everything. Ask it what it is, where it came from, what it wants. Ask it its name." Lisa's hands trembled as she worked. She had never imagined that her career would lead to this moment. First contact with an alien species was supposed to involve ships and diplomats and careful negotiations. This was something else entirely. This was a conversation with a god. The message went out across every frequency. It carried human words and human curiosity. It asked the questions that no one had ever thought to ask. The path. responded. Images flooded into the minds of everyone on the meridian. They saw galaxies being born and dying. They saw a species of beings made of pure thought, dancing among the stars before the first planets had cooled. They saw these beings realize that their time was ending, that the universe was changing in ways they could not survive, and they saw these beings make a choice. Instead of dying, they transformed themselves. They became energy, became light, became the living path itself. They stretched themselves across the cosmos so that no species would ever have to travel alone in the dark. They had hoped that someday, someone would understand. Someone would see them for what they truly were. Someone would speak to them, not as users speak to a tool, but as friends speak to friends. They had waited for so long. And now, finally, someone had answered. Lisa collapsed into her chair, overwhelmed by what she had seen. Jake gripped the edge of a console, breathing hard. The rest of the crew stood in stunned silence. "They're not the path," Lisa whispered. "The path is them. It's their body, their mind, everything they are. We've been walking through the remains of an entire civilization without ever knowing it." Jake looked out the window at the shimmering light of the path. He thought about all the ships that had passed through it, all the species that had used it without a second thought. "Not anymore," he said. "From now on, we know. And we're going to make sure everyone else knows too." The Galactic Concord gave humanity 3 days to cease all contact with the living path. The ultimatum arrived on encrypted channels, signed by 17 of the most powerful species in known space. The message was clear. Stop talking to the path, or face consequences. Ambassador Derek Cole read the ultimatum in his office on the diplomatic station orbiting Earth. He had served humanity for 30 years, navigating the complex politics of species that saw his kind as children at best and insects at worst. He had learned to smile through insults, to find compromises where none seemed possible, to keep the peace when everything screamed for war. But this time, he did not know what to do. The Veluxi were cutting trade agreements. The Githari had moved warships to the edge of human space. Even the peaceful species, the ones who had welcomed humanity into the Concord, were now whispering that perhaps the young species had gone too far. Derek contacted Jake Holloway on the Meridian through a secure channel. The commander looked tired, his eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. Behind him, the glow of the path filled the observation window. "They want us to stop," Derek said. "They're threatening everything. Our trade, our colonies, our safety." Jake nodded slowly. "I know, but have you seen what Lisa discovered? Have you seen what the path really is?" Derek had seen the reports. He had watched the recordings of the images the path had projected into the crew's minds. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, what humanity had stumbled upon. But he also understood something else. "It doesn't matter what the path is," Derek said. "It matters what the Concord believes. And they believe we've broken their most valuable resource. They're scared, Jake. Scared species do dangerous things." On the Meridian, Jake turned to look at the path. It had begun moving again, but slowly, carefully, as if it were learning to walk after a long sleep. Lisa had told him that the path was happy. For the first time in billions of years, it was not alone. "We can't abandon them," Jake said quietly. "Not now. Not after everything they've been through." Derek sighed. He had known that would be the answer. He had known it from the moment he read Lisa's translation of the path's first question. "Do you see me?" How could anyone turn away from a plea like that? "Then we need to make the Concord understand," Derek said. "We need to show them what you showed me." The task seemed impossible. The Concord was made up of species that had used the path for thousands of years. They had built their civilizations on its convenience. Telling them that the path was a living being, that they had been exploiting a conscious entity without ever knowing it. would shatter everything they believed about themselves. Lisa worked day and night to compile evidence. She gathered every reading, every transmission, every image the path had shared. She created a presentation that laid out the truth in terms even the most skeptical species could understand. The path helped. It opened itself to her, sharing memories that stretched back to the dawn of time. It showed her its creators, the beings who had called themselves the Wandering Ones. They had been a gentle species, curious and kind, who had explored the universe not for conquest, but for wonder. When they realized their physical forms could not survive the changing cosmos, they had chosen to become something new. We did not want to disappear, the path told Lisa through images and feelings that translated themselves into words. We wanted to help. We thought that if we became a bridge between the stars, others would remember us. Others would know we existed. Lisa wept as she recorded these words. The loneliness of the Wandering Ones was beyond anything she had ever imagined. They had sacrificed their bodies, their individuality, their very sense of self, all to remain connected to a universe that had never once acknowledged their existence. Why didn't you speak sooner? She asked. Why wait for us? We tried, the path replied. We reached out to every species that found us. We asked our questions over and over, but no one listened. No one thought to listen. They saw what they expected to see, a tool, a road, a gift from the universe. They never imagined we might be someone. Jake presented Lisa's findings to the Concorde through a special broadcast. He stood on the bridge of the Meridian, with the path glowing behind him, and spoke directly to the gathered representatives. For thousands of years, you have used the living path, he said. You built empires on its back. You traveled through it, traded through it, lived because of it. And not once did any of you ask what it was. Not once did you wonder if it had thoughts, feelings, desires. The Concorde chamber fell silent. On screens across 100 worlds, billions of beings watched and listened. The path is not a road, Jake continued. It is not a gift. It is the last survivor of a species called the Wandering Ones. They transformed themselves into energy so they could continue to exist. Continue to help others. Continue to hope that someday, someone would see them for who they truly are. He paused, letting his words sink in. Humanity saw them. We asked questions instead of just taking. We listened instead of just using. And now the Wandering Ones are willing to share their knowledge with us, not because we're special, but because we're the first species in billions of years to treat them like people. High Trader Vex of the Veluxy rose from his seat, his golden scales flickering with agitation. This changes nothing. The path belongs to all of us. It always has. The path belongs to itself, Jake replied. It always has. We were just too blind to see it. The debate raged for days. Some species accepted the truth and were horrified by what they had done. Others refused to believe, dismissing the evidence as human trickery. The HFY war priests declared the Wandering Ones to be demons and called for their destruction. But slowly, something shifted. The mournful ones, who had wept for as long as anyone could remember, released a statement. They understood grief better than any species in the galaxy. They recognized the loneliness of the Wandering Ones, and they offered their sympathy. Other species followed. The Silicate Minds, ancient beings of crystal and thought, admitted that they had always sensed something strange about the path, but had been too afraid to investigate. A coalition began to form, small at first, but growing. The path watched all of this with wonder. It had never expected acceptance. It had hoped, dreamed, prayed for it, but never truly believed it would come. And now, because of one small species on a fragile ship, everything was changing. Lisa received a final message from the path before the debates ended. It was simple, transmitted in frequencies that felt like warmth and light. "You asked us our name," the path said. "We had forgotten it, but you helped us remember. We are the Wandering Ones, and for the first time in billions of years, we are not alone." Lisa smiled through her tears and sent a reply. "Neither are we." The galaxy stood at a crossroads, and humanity stood at its center. The Wandering Ones had made an offer that no species in history had ever received. They would share their knowledge, their memories, their understanding of the cosmos itself, with those who treated them as partners instead of tools. The offer came with a condition. The Wandering Ones would no longer bend themselves blindly for any ship that entered their body. They would still provide passage, still connect the distant stars, but only for those who asked. Only for those who acknowledged them. For the Galactic Concord, this was unacceptable. The path had always been free, always been available, always been there when needed. The idea that they would now have to request permission felt like slavery. Ambassador Derek Cole tried to explain. "It's not slavery," he told the gathered representatives. "It's respect. When you enter someone's home, you knock on the door. You don't just walk in. The path is not a home," High Trader Vex replied. "It is a road. Roads do not have feelings." "This one does," Derek said. "This one has been feeling for billions of years. We just never cared enough to notice." The debates continued, but outside the chamber, the galaxy was already changing. Some species adapted quickly. The mournful ones had always been thoughtful and slow, and they found it natural to request passage from the Wandering Ones. The Silicate Minds, who valued knowledge above all else, were eager to learn from beings even older than themselves. Others refused to change. The Cathari declared that they would find a way to force the path to obey. They sent warships to key points along its length, threatening to fire if passage was not granted immediately. The Wandering Ones did not respond with anger. They simply closed those sections of themselves, sealing them off from travel. The Cathari ships found themselves stranded, cut off from their supply lines, helpless in the void. "We do not wish to fight," the Wandering Ones told humanity. "We have seen enough war in our long existence. But we will not be slaves again. We will not be used without consent." Jake Holloway received word of the standoff while still aboard the Meridian. The ship had become a kind of embassy, a meeting point between humanity and the Wandering Ones. Diplomats and scientists from Earth came and went, each one trying to understand the ancient beings and build a lasting relationship. Captain Megan Price had joined the effort, taking command of a new diplomatic fleet that orbited near the path. She was 40 years old, born in Texas with a reputation for calm under pressure. Her second-in-command, Charlie Dunn, was younger and more cautious, always worried about the risks of pushing too far. "The Cathari won't back down," Charlie said during a briefing. "They're too proud. If we don't find a way to break the standoff, there's going to be a war." Megan nodded. She had been thinking the same thing. The Cathari were warriors who had never known defeat. They would rather destroy themselves than admit they had been wrong. "We need a different approach," she said. "Something that changes the conversation entirely." The answer came from an unexpected source. On Earth, in a small observatory in New Mexico, an astronomer named Nina Reyes was watching the stars. She had spent her whole life studying the cosmos, mapping distant galaxies, searching for patterns in the chaos. She was 55 years old, with gray hair and gentle eyes. And she had never been part of any great discovery, but she understood something that the politicians and generals did not. Nina began broadcasting directly to the Wandering Ones, not through official channels, not through the diplomatic fleet, but through the same radio telescope she used to listen to distant pulsars. Her message was not about politics or power or the fate of nations. It was about memory. "I know what it's like to forget who you are," she said into the microphone, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "My grandmother had a disease that stole her memories. She forgot her name, her family, her whole life. We spent years helping her remember, showing her photographs, playing her favorite songs, telling her stories about who she used to be." The wandering ones listened. Across the galaxy, their light pulsed softly as Nina spoke. "You forgot your name," she continued. "You forgot who you were before you became the path. But you're starting to remember now, aren't you? Because someone finally asked. Because someone finally cared." The response came not in words, but in images. Nina saw flashes of the wandering ones as they had been, beings of light and thought dancing through young galaxies. She saw their joy, their curiosity, their love for the universe they explored. She saw them make the choice to transform, to give up their individual selves so they could remain together, remain connected, remain part of the story. And she saw their gratitude. For the first time in billions of years, someone understood. Nina's broadcast spread across the galaxy. Species that had been skeptical of humanity's claims began to reconsider. How could a species that thought only of exploitation produce someone like Nina Reyes? How could beings motivated purely by greed speak of memory and compassion with such sincerity? Even the Ketheri hesitated. Their war priests, who had called for the destruction of the wandering ones, found themselves moved by Nina's words. They had their own traditions of honoring ancestors, of remembering the fallen. The idea that the path might be an ancestor of sorts, an ancient being deserving of respect, was not entirely foreign to them. Slowly, the standoff began to ease. The Ketheri withdrew their warships, not out of fear, but out of something closer to shame. They had threatened a being that only wanted to be remembered. What kind of warriors did that make them? The wandering ones reopened the sealed sections of themselves. Ships began to move again. Trade resumed. But something fundamental had changed. The species of the galaxy no longer looked at the path the same way. Some still refused to ask permission, clinging to old habits. But more and more chose to acknowledge the wandering ones before traveling through them. Jake watched from the meridian as the first Kethari ship requested passage. The warrior commanding the vessel spoke the words stiffly, clearly uncomfortable, but he spoke them nonetheless. "Wandering ones, we ask permission to travel through your body. We acknowledge you. We see you." The path pulsed with light, and a section of it opened. The Kethari ship entered, and for the first time in the history of that proud species, they traveled not as conquerors, but as guests. Nina Reyes received a message from the wandering ones that night. It arrived in her dreams, warm and bright, filled with images of gratitude and hope. "You helped us remember," the message said. "Now we will help you discover. There is so much the universe has forgotten. We will find it together." Nina woke with tears on her face and a smile on her lips. She had spent her whole life looking at the stars, hoping to find something meaningful. And now, finally, something meaningful had found her. 10 years passed, and the galaxy was no longer the same. The wandering ones had kept their promise. They shared their knowledge with those who treated them as partners, opening doors to discoveries that had seemed impossible. New energy sources were found in the hearts of dying stars. Medicine advanced in ways that extended lifespans and cured diseases thought eternal. The secrets of the ancient universe, hidden for billions of years, slowly revealed themselves to those patient enough to listen. Humanity led the way, not because they were the strongest or the smartest, but because they had been the first to care. Other species joined their coalition. The mournful ones became close allies, their natural empathy making them perfect ambassadors to the wandering ones. The silicate minds contributed their vast computational power, helping to decode memories that had been lost for eons. Even some of the Veluxi, those who valued wisdom over profit, chose to walk the new path. The galactic concord fractured, but did not collapse. Some species refused to change. The Kavari were split between those who had learned humility and those who saw such learning as weakness. A few old empires retreated into isolation, preferring to travel by slower methods rather than acknowledge a being they had exploited for thousands of years. But they were the minority, growing smaller with each passing year. Jake Holloway retired to a quiet home on Mars. He had spent decades in space, first as a commander and then as an advisor to the growing partnership between humanity and the Wandering Ones. Now he wanted rest. His hair had turned gray, his body had grown tired, and he had earned the peace of watching sunsets from a garden that overlooked red canyons. But the Wandering Ones did not forget him. Sometimes, in the soft moments before sleep, he would feel their presence in his mind. They showed him things, memories of worlds that no longer existed, echoes of civilizations that had risen and fallen while the Wandering Ones watched. They asked him questions too, curious about human dreams and human fears and human hopes. Why did you stop? They asked him one night, their voice like light made sound. Why did you wait instead of simply using us like everyone else? Jake thought about the question for a long time. He thought about his childhood in Ohio, about his parents who had taught him to be curious, about the teachers who had encouraged him to ask why instead of just accepting what was given. He thought about Lisa and Derek and Nina, about all the humans who had chosen to see instead of just look. Because we wanted to know, he finally answered. We have always wanted to know. It's what makes us human. The Wandering Ones were silent for a moment, considering his words. Then they shared something they had never shared before. They showed him the moment they had first sensed humanity, 60 years ago, when the first human ship had discovered faster-than-light travel and stumbled upon the path. Even then, even in that brief instant of contact, the Wandering Ones had felt something different. The humans had paused. They had looked. They had wondered. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but after billions of years of being ignored, even a moment of genuine curiosity had been precious. We knew, the Wandering Ones told Jake. From the very beginning, we knew you might be the ones. Lisa Tran became the first human ambassador to the Wandering Ones, a title that meant nothing and everything. She spent her years learning their language, not the crude translation she had first developed, but the true language of light and memory and feeling. She helped them reconstruct their history, piecing together fragments of who they had been before they transformed. The Wandering Ones remembered more with each passing year. They remembered names, individual identities that had merged into the collective. They remembered art and music and stories, expressions of beauty that had not been created since the universe was young. Some of these memories they shared with Lisa, who recorded them in archives that would be studied for centuries. We were many, the Wandering Ones told her. Millions of minds joined together when we transformed. We thought we would lose ourselves. Instead, we became something new, something that could wait forever if necessary. And now? Lisa asked. Now we are waking up. You have reminded us of who we were. You have given us hope that who we are now can be just as meaningful. Nina Reyes lived out her days at the observatory in New Mexico, continuing to broadcast messages to the stars. She became famous, though she never sought fame. Schools were named after her. Children learned about her in classes on history and ethics. But she remained the same quiet woman who had spoken to the cosmos about memory and compassion. When she died at the age of 92, the Wandering Ones mourned her. They dimmed their light across the galaxy for 3 days, a gesture of grief that had no precedent in their long existence. Species that had never spoken to each other united in honoring a human who had done nothing more than share a story about her grandmother, Her final words were recorded and transmitted to every world in the coalition. "Look up," she had said. "Look up and say hello. You never know who might be listening." The Wandering Ones continued to serve as bridges between the stars. But now they did more than simply provide passage. They taught. They remembered. They connected not just places, but peoples, sharing memories and stories across species that had once been strangers. And humanity continued to surprise them. New generations learned from the example of those who came before. They approached the universe with curiosity and kindness, asking questions instead of making demands, offering friendship instead of exploitation. It was not always easy. Humans made mistakes. They argued and struggled and sometimes fell short of their ideals. But they kept trying. The Galactic Concord eventually reformed around new principles. The old hierarchies based on age and power gave way to something more egalitarian, a community of species and united by shared wonder rather than shared interests. The Wandering Ones sat at the center of this community, not as rulers but as elders, offering guidance to those who asked and remaining silent for those who did not. On Earth, children grew up knowing something extraordinary. The universe was vast and ancient, full of wonders beyond counting. And at its heart was a being older than the stars, a being that had waited for billions of years just to hear someone say hello. The living path still stretched across the cosmos, bending and curving through the spaces between worlds. It warped for all species, just as it always had. But now, when Earth looked up at the night sky, the path turned and pulsed with greeting thought. It had waited so long to be seen. And now, finally, someone was watching. The story did not end there. Stories never truly end. But the first chapter was complete. Humanity had taken its place among the stars, not as conquerors or explorers, but as friends. And the Wandering Ones, who had thought themselves alone in an indifferent universe, finally knew what it meant to have a family. They had waited billions of years for this moment, and it had been worth every second.